Welcome to today's webinar on crime in Canada, an expose. We're going to be looking at organized crime, drug trafficking, and financial corruption. The featured speaker will be Charlie Meredith. I'm a little disappointed, I have to tell you, that Francis McGilvery will not be joining us for reasons that I won't get into, but it has something to do with the readiness of the police system to be exposed. I'm throwing tongue in cheek on that. Regardless, I want to welcome you, Charlie.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to this topic. Your newsletter was extensive, thorough, and if nothing else, scary for those of us that think we live in a relatively peaceful environment, and maybe many of us do. There's something obviously going on under the surface or over the surface that's not being paid attention to. So I'm going to ask you right off the bat, what motivated you to write this report? The report challenges the perception of Canada as a low crime nation. It highlights its crucial role in global crime networks, and we seem to have become a center without realizing it. So understanding your motivation can shed light on how these issues have been ignored and what should change. So off to you for question number one. What motivated you to do this?
Well, when Trump came out of the chute and talking about tariffs on Canada, and Canada needed to get its act together regarding drug dealing and human trafficking, the pushback was always people heard tariffs. And the secondary was, well, we don't have a drug problem. All of 17 pounds was intercepted at the border last year in 2024. So how in the world is Canada a drug problem? This all comes from Mexico. That's not a Canada problem. From 97 until a few years ago, I did extensive organizational work with police services across Canada, with the RCMP, Edmonton Police Service, Calgary Police Service, and actually some work with the LAPD as well. And unfortunately, that's not the case. We got a huge problem. The fact that 17 pounds of fentanyl was found was a symptom of a massive problem that we're not catching anything versus a no problem that we caught everything. And I think we need to shed some light in terms of what Canada need to interact together. We got a real problem. We got I think it's was it 50,000 dead Canadians in the last 8 years from fentanyl alone, plus all the associated deaths. There's nothing clean on this. So it's an ongoing war on drugs. We've had the war on drugs for 6,000 years since man first fermented grapes. Society is trying to fight it, and Canada's got a problem dealing with it. So chapter number 3,465 on the war on drugs.
Now I'm not, before I dive any deeper, you're not a policeman, but you've had involvement with policing in some way. Give me a little bit of background on the array of things that you got involved in as a consultant. It adds to the credibility of this discussion.
Well, with KPMG and Bearing Point, we did 2 reviews of the Edmonton Police Service from an organizational effectiveness perspective, not from how best to go arrest the bad guy, but how should they be organized, how they should be managed, how they're using the resources, etc. Done several engagements for the RCMP, specific topics. Effectiveness, do we need a new station in Drayton Valley? We need a new station in Fort Murray. Other places around Alberta, BC. Did a lot of work around organized crime with, I'll call it the Calgary Airport Authority regarding taxis, and that involved both the RCMP, Calgary Police Service. Did some work with the LAPD and other services on a mounted patrol. So I've done about 3 months of ride-alongs with police services across Canada and in the U.S. Also the CN Police, which is internal police service, and they're all about smuggling, etc. So been around cops a lot.
And you spent some time with casinos, if I'm not mistaken, as well.
Absolutely, did a lot of, with KPMG and Bearing Point, a lot of work on casinos as well. Casinos and at the time the regulator was called AGLC.
So in terms of, right. So in your report, you suggest that organized crime is deeply embedded in our economy and financial institutions. I guess that is where the lifeline or the lifeblood exists. This question invites a global comparison. We talk about Canada, but how do we compare with others? Maybe this is just common globally. So can you give me any analysis of why Canada may be particularly vulnerable?
I mean, it is common globally. The basic problem with this entire subject, we don't have any numbers. The absolute numbers we know how, in terms of drugs that have been seized, We know how people have died from drug deaths, but drug organizations, organized crime aren't public organizations, right? They don't publish quarterly results, so we don't know the numbers. But seeing the numbers in the U.S., numbers in the U.K., numbers elsewhere, Canada's numbers are very low. So can Canada be the outlier and not have a drug problem, organized crime problem, or are we just miles behind in terms of enforcement? And logic would tell you we're miles behind in enforcement.
So the US and UK have strong financial oversight mechanisms. Is financial oversight one of the issues that we have here?
It is, as you said, Perry. The money is the head of the snake. There, I mean, I guess number one, there wouldn't be a drug problem if it wasn't demand. For 6,000 years, we haven't solved demand, so let's move on to the second one. There wouldn't be drugs if there wasn't money to be made. You can make money, but what do you do with $1 billion cash? You can't just go to the local 7-Eleven and buy popsicles. So you have to launder the money somewhere. Some jurisdictions, like the U.S., for example, U.S., Britain, some of the Asian countries like Japan, Western Europe, have very strong money laundering protections. They've been there, done that, and they've ramped up the enforcement. Miami apparently was built in the 80s by South American drug money until the U.S. got serious about it. Their system's called is it FinCEN, or ours is FinTrack. Through experience and having a problem, they got their act together and put resources. By resources, I'm talking legislation, technology, and people to fix it, where we haven't done that.
Well, we're in a geographic position next to the United States, which is pretty well off. I mean, people have capital, they've got money. So there's a lot of pull, I would imagine, in the US. But to have 4,000 organized crime groups implies that this is a very well organized infrastructure. This just isn't incidental numbers game on a street corner.
Very much so. I mean, the head of the RCM, the commissioner of the RCMP, made that statement a few months ago about the 4,000 organized crimes now, or organized crime organizations. Now that can be anything from two people. I get two people make an organization to a chapter of the Mexican cartels, Asian triads, Hell's Angels, etc. Again, we don't really know. The RCMP and police organizations know more than they want to disclose. Obviously, you're chasing these guys, so you don't want to show your hand. But we've got a pittance of people chasing 4,000 gangs who are bringing drugs into Canada, bringing them into the U.S. across the 5,500-mile border, plus all that coastline. It's David versus Goliath, and Goliath is doing pretty well right now.
Well, coastline, I mean, we've got some of the longest coastline in the world, which means your ports are all vulnerable. That's your Halifax, your Vancouvers, and whatever.
Absolutely. And just the 5,500 miles. I mean, Mexico is about a 2,000-mile border with the U.S. Canada's 5,500 miles, and most of it's wilderness.
Yeah. So we talk about law enforcement resources in order to police those boundaries and also to track the 4,000, and whether it be Hell's Angels or emerging cartels. What about the sentencing? I mean, it's all well and good to scare them off because you've got heavy sentencing. I heard the candidate for prime minister saying we ought to reinstate the death penalty for fentanyl. There's probably some sympathy for that, but do we have a sentencing issue as well?
Well, it's not really there is a sentencing issue, but the bigger one is the actual prosecution issue. We have all the systems the U.S. have, but they don't work very well. You look at the prosecutions, the U.S. prosecute all sorts of people for money laundering, drug dealing. Canada's prosecuted virtually nobody beyond very low-level dealers. The other players in here for prosecution are the banks. Ultimately, when you launder money, the choke point are the banks. Banks in the U.S. and there's been many billion-dollar fines for money laundering in the U.S., financial propriety, allowing folks to do stuff they shouldn't be doing. Canadian banks, if you look at what fines they've received, they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, yeah, you can get the cartel guy and say, oh, you get the death penalty. That's fine. But the bigger issue is the process to launder that money. We're talking billions of dollars, we think. Again, we don't know. because there's so little about little that we know, but the process doesn't work. Our databases don't talk to each other. They're hard to use. They don't interact well with international databases. And trying to get a conviction for money laundering is truly squeezing a snake, whatever, out of a snake. Takes forever. And at the end of the day, someone gets a 6-month sentence and no restitution. So what have you accomplished?
And yet, in my discussions with you, we keep on landing on the money laundering, that if you're going to stop this, you're not likely to stop consumption. I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to say to the American citizens or the Canadian citizens, no more drugs. Well, I mean, I think Reagan tried that, that the war on drugs was not going to happen at the demand level. It was going to happen at the supply level,
Right.
which ultimately meant the money. I mean, if anybody's saw the movie Blow, we're not talking, we're
Right.
talking about garages from ceiling
Yeah.
to floor of dollar bills, 150, $5 bills, all collected from people that whether they're getting it from their pizza joint or getting it from their local supplier, cash is flowing in huge volumes. When you mentioned to me what you see in a casino, that's lightweight compared to what some of these cartels or
Yeah.
whatever are gathering.
Very much so, and that's the issue. They have a garage full of cash. What do you do with it? Need a complicit bank to launder that through ultimately. Now, the criminals found, or the organizations found Toronto and Vancouver real estate especially attractive. You had expensive properties. You set up 20 shell companies. You sell properties back and forth. You have FinTrack. My realtor will say, "What are you talking about?"
Selling prop, what does that mean? Walk me through that.
So you have illicit cash you want to get rid of. Well, a nice way is to take $1 million of that and buy a condo. You need a bank to turn that cash into a payment on a condo. Let's say $1 million. Okay, then you sell, and you're a company, you set up 20 shell companies around your entity. ABC owns DEF, owns XYZ. And you sell the condos to each of your shell companies. Every time you sell that condo, that cash becomes legitimate. So you can take $1 million payment, then you sell it to your other shell company for $1 million. Well, that $1 million is now lost. So at the end of the day, the company and the 20 subsidiaries have sold 100 condos back and forth. You now have $100 million that's legitimate. And we saw that in Vancouver when so many of these expensive properties, the beneficial owner was an 18-year-old student, a foreign student. And
This
um,
Vancouver model has been, they've drawn comparisons with it to the financial crime hubs like Las Vegas and Miami. And we are now a
right,
world renowned. We've got
very
something
much
that the
so.
world didn't
Very
know.
much so. And you ask, well, why were I mean, the thought was the Vancouver market was so hot because people come from Hong Kong, etc., before '99, but it's carried on that way. And I mean, the thought is that those two markets were driven partially by drug money. And um, on one hand, I mean, if you want to be flippant, you can say on the one hand, it's foreign investment. But on the other hand, that's blood money, and there's a whole bunch of dead people behind that money. Dead people somewhere, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere.
So why is Canada, maybe not why, we have a issue of cooperation between Canada and the US as it relates to money laundering.
Right. Well, is it cooperation or is it lack of will? I mean, the obviously you're getting down to what do you want to do about it? What has to change? And the first one has to be the will. Do we recognize there's a problem? We want to do something about it. The U.S. has great resort. Or U.S. have great resources to go at this. Their financial systems are integrated. They have um, prosecution systems where they can get prosecutions and big penalties, etc. Canada has none of that. So um, again, as I was saying, to actually convict somebody for money laundering, it takes years and a lot of resources. And if you think, and I'm a downsizing guy originally, so to say throw resources at something hurts me. But ultimately, we've got 300 RCMP chasing 4,000 organized crime units, plus another 300 people probably between the OPP, QPP, and the municipal police services. Let's say 700 people chasing 4,000 criminal gangs. And it takes years to prosecute one transaction or series of transactions for money laundering. And the math just doesn't add up.
I'll bet traffic enforcement is 300 in Alberta or Edmonton and Calgary alone. Okay.
Don't you dare drive 70 in a 60 zone.
Well, I mean, just to put this on scale, I'll come back to that for a minute. I mean, there was a BC casino that was found to be laundering over $1 billion in a year.
Right,
I mean, it used to be a million here and a million there, you know, real money. Now we're talking billions. A
right,
billion dollars in 1 year in
right,
one casino. The Cullen
right.
Commission in 22 found 5 to 7 billion annually was being laundered in the real estate market. This is just BC.
And those are guesstimates. It's probably more than that. I would
Okay.
think it's more than that. And the reason you can do casinos, I saw it personally at KPMG. We actually did a soft receivership for an Edmonton casino. And I sold the job. I had to give it to the receivership guys, but I was able to spend some time there, sit in the camera room, the security room, and watch how it operated. And one of the folks showed me there was a table, and 7 or 8 young guys rolled in with $30,000 cash. They played poker for an hour. The money went through, and they all got their chips back. One guy went out to his car outside, came back with 30,000 more cash. And this is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. What were they doing? Where are these, young 20-year-old getting their cash from?
Okay, so they're moving money into a casino. It's somehow got to get out of that casino into the hands of,
I mean, ultimately, the easiest way, you just go and buy chips and then turn your chips in 15 minutes later. I mean, that's
I see. Okay.
now measures have been taken to flag resources, flag people doing this. So now they're going to cover their tracks a bit, so they're going to go play it. But if you take every seat at a poker table,
Right.
the money all goes back to the gang, and the house gets cut. So if you're losing 10% of your money as a laundering fee, that's not bad.
Gotcha.
And you got to go play cards for 2 hours. Not the end of the road for those guys. But I saw it with my own eyes, and that's to your point. That's the tip of the iceberg.
So,
At Vancouver casinos, you start playing high end games, you can launder a whole lot more.
so understanding the flow of money is to understand how these overall systems, human trafficking, drug trafficking, real estate, financial
Right.
corruption, et cetera. Let's dive into the drug issue. I mean, we start out with the president in the U.S. His name escapes me at the moment, but he's brought to Canadians' attention that there's a fentanyl issue at the border. You pointed out, and I think it's been pointed out to him several times, that the amount of drugs is a fraction of what's passing back and forth to Mexico. But there is something else going back and forth across the money, across the border, and it's not fentanyl itself; it's the precursors. The precursors to fentanyl and methamphetamine, and those chemicals being producing fentanyl when they get into the States. Is that what we've been missing? It's not so much the fentanyl itself, it's all of the ingredients going into it.
Yes and no. We don't know how much is going to and from the States. I mean, if Canada caught 17 pounds of fentanyl in 24, I believe. And that's the number's been thrown around, and you Google it, you get that number. That just tells me that our systems are weak and we're not catching anything.
Well,
So
we know we're producing a lot. I mean, that
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, one of the epidemics that's kind of a telltale sign, this stolen car epidemic in Eastern Canada. That containers full of stolen cars are heading off to Africa and the Middle East. We're not doing anything about it. Those containers are coming back full of drugs, and we're not catching that either. It's a Canada would seem to be the drug, like in Europe, Albania is the dirty deeds done dirt cheap place. In North America, Canada seems to become the dirty deeds done dirt cheap place because the enforcement is so poor. We're miles behind the drug dealers, both in terms of the drug side and the money side.
could it be that, I mean, you mentioned 50,000 people died of fentanyl last year? That was Americans or
In
Canadians?
the last eight, no, in the last 8 years.
So until such time as Canada understands and the public understands, RCMP's hands are sort of tied because the politicians that own or operate or finance this system are only going to finance the system that they know exists and is in fact creating pain. Somebody's
Right.
getting and spending this money. Maybe it's a good thing for Canada to have billions of dollars being harvested and kept in the country for purposes of buying up real estate and mobilizing our economy. Tongue in
Well,
cheek there, but you and I have
well
laughed
said,
about
Terry.
that.
If you want just foreign investment, which is basically blood money, sure. And again, it's tongue in cheek, but the bigger issue is, do we have the political will to change it? It's going to cost money ultimately. So Canada's got a $3 trillion deficit now. We've had um, our economy, Canada's as weakest in decades, potentially right now. Do we have the money to do this now? So we've discovered we've got a problem. Now people are getting upset. Now, holy smokes, we don't have any money. And we can't, surely God can't tax anymore. Do we want to borrow more money to do this? This is good. Ultimately, it's going to cost a lot of money to update um, our technology using, and AI is out there, obviously, to spend more resources. And again, I'm the downsizing guy. I'm the last guy to say throw bodies at the problem, but goodness gracious, we need to up our game because, we got David and Goliath going on right now. And how many folks we want to let die?
These conviction rates for financial crimes remain below 20% compared to over 50% in the US. So
And I think that's an overstatement. I think 20% is high for us, and I think 50% is probably low for the U.S.
when you talk to people in the RCMP, would the RCMP be sympathetic? Are they making appeals to the politicians that we need help? Is there a dialogue that has even begun between the RCMP to make the politicians aware that there's an issue? Did it take Donald Trump, there's the name, to
Who's
awake
doing?
to create this awakening in Canada to start policing our borders, which Danielle Smith has now put increased vigilance and drones, etc. It took Donald Trump to bring this issue to our attention.
Well, it certainly took Donald Trump to bring it to the front page. Like I say, I mean, my whole life I've heard about the war on drugs. So I think people, and especially in the last few, like since it was a 21 election when Canada legalized marijuana, and they've moved on to mushrooms and a bit of a laissez-faire approach to drugs, that it disappeared. And a little bit of a buyer beware, right? If you want to be ripped on fentanyl and die, well, that's your choice. As an attitude, at least at a political level, it certainly took Donald Trump to say, "Wait a minute, you got a problem here. I'm going to tariff the heck out of you until you fix it, and fix it now." Um, that hasn't changed. Every policeman has dealt with drugs their entire life. And I did three months of ride-alongs to the RCMP and other police agencies, and virtually every call we went to, drugs or alcohol was involved.
Mhm.
You talk about a scourge of society. Um, good. I'll tell you what. Just spend a couple of days with cops, um, and it's 10 calls every day, especially on a Friday or Saturday night. Good gracious. Drugs and alcohol certainly are not our friend.
Couldn't we redirect the police to doing policing instead of doing traffic monitoring? I mean, it seems to me
Yeah,
the resources that we got are being allocated to something quite domestic, which on scale.
yeah. Well, that's again, all crime is crime, right? So where do you want to allocate resources? I mean, I think we got to work smarter than harder here. Obviously, I mean, with the technology we have today, the AI that's coming, you'd think that FinTrack can certainly be augmented, exponentially augmented to 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 get after this money laundering side. Which to get after the money laundering side, you certainly help yourself on the organized crime side because they'll get to the dodge real fast if Canada becomes unsafe to go into the money.
So is FinTrack up to speed when it comes to what clearly is emerging, which is the relevance of cryptocurrency as a means of
Well, not
reallocating
not
wealth?
not really. FinTrack is just a database, and the problem is we've got don't have the tools to harvest the data to do something with it. It's kind of the old school. We'll do lumberjack strokes of whatever we're doing, but if there's nothing going to harvest that data or analyze it, do something with it, do something productive with it, wasting our time.
So I,
I
I
talked to a realtor. You talk to a realtor right now, they'll complain about the FinTrack stuff. I had lunch with a realtor yesterday. He said, "Good Lord, this is onerous. The stuff we want to do. You want us to do more?" So that's the data in, but then what do you do with it? We've got nobody looking at it. You don't have good tools to slice and dice it, to do something productive with. And then even if you do, it takes you forever to lay a charge, and then the courts do nothing with it. And one of the things, and just understand when you're prosecuting somebody in Canada, you have to disclose all of your sources of information, the information where it came from. Well, to quote a Breaking Bad, anybody, any of your sources of information, might just go away for a while
Yeah.
and a long time. So you're not dealing with, but these people understand brute force and nothing else.
So your report recommended tougher sentences. I mean,
Absolutely.
you've got to
Absolutely.
get, but you've got to get someone into court before you apply the sentence.
Right.
You are saying once they're in the court, if we can only begin to threaten these systems with tougher sentences, we might have some impact on the crimes and drug
Right.
trafficking. So do you want to address the stricter penalty side of the
Yeah.
equation?
I mean, again, to reinforce, it's getting the ability to actually lay a charge and so you can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the choke point. But the sentences too. Again, Canada has very liberal drug laws. So so if you can get people into court, absolutely tougher sentences, right? I mean, again, these people understand force. If you're looking at going to prison for 20 years, different than looking at going to prison for 6 months.
Well,
And
the US has mandatory minimums for drug and financial crimes,
yeah,
while Canada relies on discretionary sentencing. It's
absolutely,
pretty small.
absolutely. You know, in the U.S., you'll have Madoff's old cell for 20 years until a certain president might pardon you. But yeah, you're looking at serious time in the U.S. That's the problem. Canada, it's discretionary, and the sentences we're seeing aren't
Well,
big.
maybe it's about time we did this handshake between countries and began to establish some common mandatory penalty and adopt the US standards.
Well, I mean that the win would be honestly to outsource it to the U.S. But I mean, they have the systems, they have the people, they have everything there. Obviously, we're a sovereign country. Unless we're the 51st state, we can't do that. But that goes to a different discussion.
Well, we're
But
going to have that discussion in Calgary as we did in Edmonton the other day, although at that the discussions we've had to date have really not zeroed in on the border issue of drugs and trafficking in general.
right,
I gather enhance asset forfeiture laws that would allow the police to seize properties linked to organized crime is
right.
another adventure or venture, but
Yeah,
not
and
something.
Canada doesn't do that. We've all seen pictures of the backwater police agencies driving a Corvette saying, you know, backwater Kentucky police agency, and they're driving a Corvette or a Ferrari or something like that. Canada, the asset forfeiture, it doesn't happen essentially.
I don't want to be a fear monger, but that's essentially what this discussion is all about. Is we've got a problem that we're not aware of, therefore we're not particularly fearful of it. You're bringing us to it to our attention. Are you at all optimistic that you're seeing some ripples of awareness? I mean, thank you, Donald Trump, but he has in fact lit a fuse. And some Canadians seem to be saying we've got to do something about it. So, do you believe that Canada will implement any meaningful reforms?
Depends on the election, depends on who the new liberal leader is. Um, you know, Trump came out of the gate saying, look, there's tariffs until you clean up your human trafficking and drug problem. All people heard are tariffs, obviously, because anything that affects your bank account is what you think about. Um, honestly, I believe 2 days after he made that announcement, all I've heard is about tariffs and nothing, I'm not saying nothing, very little about the drug problem.
Well,
You know,
real estate and business sectors have been resisting transparency reforms. I remember an interview just yesterday with Goldman Sachs, and it was brought to their attention the $100 million fine or 100 billion. It was a very large number that a bank had been fined, and the interviewer was saying, "Look, we've got to do more in this area." And he was saying, "Look, the banks need to make profits. They don't have the time and they don't have the money. This is going to
right.
erode their profits." So it's going to have to take something more than market forces, which means regulatory play
Well,
and
very much
governments
so.
being empowered by the voter or by some problem to say we need to address this issue. But we've been lacking a strong, independent, anti-corruption body. We don't have one like the United States Security Commission, SEC.
No, no, we don't. And the banks, to your point, have to make money. They've been fined big time in the U.S., like RBC, TD. They've been fined big time in the U.S., not fined in Canada. And much like the financial markets, right? I mean, good gracious, they were doing those adjustable rate mortgages, securitizing them in 2007, 2008 until the whole thing blew up. But they knew it was coming, but they needed quarterly profits are more important than 5 year profits, 5 year viability. You know, your bonus depends on what you did this quarter. So they'll do anything to make money this quarter. And in Canada, it's proven if they can basically launder money and improve profits and nobody cares, get after it. And that's a harsh statement. That's a globalized statement. I don't mean to try to indict the banks, but this is the behavior that's happening.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it begins and ends with the banks.
It
If it's
does.
about money and follow the money, and you know that that money is being collected and distributed, and you know that the suppliers in that system are doing something illegal, it seems to me that's where the pressure is going to have to come. And we've got strong, we only have, what, five really large
Yeah.
banks in Canada. You would think that we could be playing a leadership role in this sector.
Well, very much so. The Canadian tradition of protecting every market, so we have to protect the banks. They all clear their money in U.S. dollars through. So there's yeah. To your point, I mean, if you control the banks, ultimately you control the money laundering, you control the organized crime, you can beat down some of the drug distribution, even though demand drives everything. If there's demand, you'll sell drugs, but at least you won't be laundering in Canada and make it very harder to operate in Canada.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the last word before I draw on the audience. I know they're just itching to ask you a question, Charlie, but if you were to talk to the next prime minister or to be on a podium to talk to the public before the next election, what would your message be?
My message would be that there's 50,000 dead Canadians and many more coming unless something changes. Um, and Canada, unfortunately, has become the dirty deeds done dirt cheap place in North America or in the Americas as it is. And we need to do something unless we want more dead people.
Okay, well, that's pretty profound. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you and see if we can engage the audience at any points they wish to make or questions they wish to pose to you.
I'll make an observation. It's something that the Canadians have known to exist. It dates our drug problems, and we different industries experience the fact that laundering from New York and out of Chicago, and nobody would listen to the industry that was involved. The industry developed its own controls, and you didn't have the deaths involved, but you certainly had people eating previously dead, not killed meat at Expo 67. And those families just didn't disappear. We have a cultural problem, and every time, I spent the first 10 years of my professional life in an industry where 40 to 50% of the industry was controlled by the bad guys. The other was good competitive industry, but we knew where we could tread and we knew where we couldn't tread. And cement boots were not loved, but they were part of the if you didn't stay in your course, cement boots were the upcome, or else you might have your whole trucking fleet in the St. Lawrence River. And that kind of stuff has been around. I first got exposed to it in 1960 when I came into that industry. And I followed it around the world, and everybody in Canada looked at me as if I was crazy when I would raise it. So I didn't bother raising it, because if you knew where the rules, the regulations that were set internal to industries, you could earn a living. Now, I don't hear anybody talking about in this presentation. I didn't hear anything about the penalties that one of the major Canadian banks paid for their business in Northeast US just
Right,
recently.
TD did, yeah.
And it was the TD Bank.
Mhm.
And they paid the fines.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'll shut up now. I don't have a solution to the problem, and I'm too old now to try and solve it. At one point in time in my life, I tried and
No,
had some success, but not in the drug industry.
this group, Barry, age is not an excuse for a lack of action. Yogi,
The comment I left in the chat is you talked about the shortage of resourcing to go after money laundering and the difficulty of gaining a conviction and the high effort involved, and the Americans seem to have some convictions. But I really wonder, regardless of what you have as a statute, regardless of what you have as talented prosecutors and talented police, is it really even feasible? Or is it a case that the drug dealers can always find yet another workaround?
I think you're right. I mean, these guys, they spend all day and night trying to do this. So it was told to me, look, our goal is try and mitigate, not eliminate. And it's almost like whack-a-mole. If you can nail them one place, they'll just come up somewhere else. You need to keep on nailing them. And the point is, as long as there's demand for drugs, there'll be sales of drugs, and there'll be ways to launder the money. So it's a perpetual game of whack-a-mole. And your point's well taken, that the drug dealers will find other ways. But right now, we're not giving them much of a fight. So there's not a lot of whack-a-mole going on.
Thank you.
So Peter McKinnon, you've noted the increased reliance or usage or integration of technology now into all processes, but in this instance, we're talking today about policing. You want to elaborate on whether or not there is a growing interest in applying technology into these sectors?
Well, as I mentioned in the chat, I've actually had the privilege to work with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the Calgary Police Service, as well as the Ottawa Police Service, specifically, among others, including agencies, in regard to the use of sensing, all kinds of technology in the sense of sensors for police work. And fire as well, by the way, fire services as well. I've done a lot with them as well as first responders in general. And yes, there's a growing interest in the use of sensing, but it's still very, very haphazard. It's not organized in any specific, national way. In fact, we don't even have a national first responder network in terms of the ability to communicate across the country, strictly within the world of the first responder. And so that's something I've also been involved in. In fact, Charlie, do you know Lance Valcourt, inspector from the Ottawa Police Service?
No.
Well, he's a pioneer in the police area in terms of trying to promote that kind of activity. In fact, I was in communication with Lance just earlier this afternoon. So yes, there's a growing interest, but it's growing at the level of individual services as opposed to the national initiatives, national organization.
Piecemeal versus a true coordinated effort, right?
I want to pick up on something that will lead me to asking Ruben a question, and that is, over the last years that we've been doing these webinars, and this is number, I think, 203 or 204, we've touched on everything from healthcare reform to education failing to now law enforcement. What they all share in common is the word public. We seem to be having some problems in modernizing our public systems, in spite of the fact that we have problems that are well-known and long-standing. Now, we laugh about this new president in the United States poking us. But the things that he's been poking is the things that we haven't been dealing with, from interprovincial trade, which is utterly ridiculous, that you got to change your tires, you got to get out of your truck and do a whole bunch of things when you cross a border in Canada going east-west, but not when you're going north-south to the U.S. The waiting lists in healthcare, the fact that our education system failed our kids for 2 years during COVID, and now we're having a discussion around law enforcement. Ruben, am I picking up on another form of a virus or an inability of a nation to grow up in order to address issues effectively? Are we so partisan, left and right, that we can't make any headway down the middle? Do you want to pick it up from here and calm me down?
No, certainly the short answer I put in the chat. One of the things that seems to me to be really clear in our response to Donald Trump and in the numbers that have disappeared from Poilievre's support that are gravitating to Mark Carney is that there is a hunger in Canada for some adults in the room. And we haven't had them. We haven't had a premier in Alberta since Don Getty that you could admire as a person. This is my view that we have become a culture that is so preoccupied with getting and spending, with becoming a modern culture and doing well. And we have done it in a classic modern way, which is in bits and pieces. And much as everybody on this understands the language of systems and whatnot, the fact is there is no place in Canada, no institution has a capacity to think about Canadian societies and the kind of things we talk about in systems terms. So education is one issue, and drugs are another, and spirituality is another, and the economy is another, and it's all bullshit. We know that. We know that complex living systems do not work the way we are organized in our heads, in our hearts, and in our institutions to respond to them. It doesn't make any difference who owns the institution. People in the Chamber of Commerce will tell you it's all because of public money and we've got to get rid of that and private sector is wonderful. They don't know how to think systems either. So we're in far more trouble than we know. And there is no place in Canada that's tackling this in a way that the closest people to it are the folks with Thomas Homer Dixon and his new institute at Royal Roads.
But I totally agree with Ruben on the issue of the systems view of things. I mean, we don't understand systems as a general view of how we govern ourselves. The one we're really talking about right now is the polycrisis of governance.
Mhm.
And we don't have a very good handle on how to collaborate and cooperate and share, whether it's data or, casual conversation in a focused way. And we don't look at any of this from a systems point of view. Canadians are starting to realize we need somebody who's got some qualification in dealing with financial matters that are at the core of what we're starting to talk about, the banks, the flow of money, both within and across borders. So I just throw that into the conversation here. Thank you.
I saw somebody a little while ago just post on a question. What if we legalized all drugs? And that's a very interesting question when you think about it. That if you legalized all drugs, you eliminate the money laundering, and there's tiers of legalization. Right, we have legalized cannabis right now, but it's so expensive. We have a black market that's half the price, so we haven't quite achieved the legalization panacea, if we will. But the thought of if we legalized all drugs, and then how does that go to pharmaceuticals? Does that mean that anybody can get what they want without a prescription? Like if you go to South Mexico, anywhere in South America, you walk into a pharmacy, if you want to buy fentanyl or oxycodone, you can without a prescription. So what would that look like in Canada? They said, okay, we can't control money laundering, we can't control the drug crimes, etc. Forget it then. Let's just legalize the whole thing and buyer beware. And I know from the very first project I did at KPMG, which is a white paper that saved gambling in Alberta in '97, that ADAC said that 4% of the population have an addictive personality and 1.4% of the population have a very addictive personality. Mm-hmm. So that means 3 out of 200 people will be addicted to something. Be gambling, drugs, liquor, cigarettes, sex, whatever it might be. So if we legalize drugs, we're looking at, let's say, 1%, we'll lose 1% of the population through addiction. And that's the trade-off there. But it's an interesting proposition, though. I don't think we should completely discount that. That's an option.
Legalizing implies free access, and we have some examples of what may happen when you have access, and we see it in the homelessness.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's my point. Well, the downside of that, well, whether it's 0.5% or 1%, pick your number, but we're going to lose half the 1% of people, 42 million Canadians. 1% is a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, something I believe, and I think it's a product of, that's why we wanted to have this session, why we have many of them. Something needs to be done. And where do you turn? Do you turn to the families? Do you turn to the schools? Do you turn to your local governments? Do you turn to your federal governments? Do you use an election? Is academia going to create a army of people that are wise enough to have influence to make a difference? Where do you even begin? Well, hopefully you begin with elevating awareness, and thank you, Ruben, and thank you, Barry, and thank you, Peter, for your inputs. But until we have an awareness and recognize that we have an opportunity, and maybe that's with a relationship with the US, or maybe we have a threat, and maybe that's a product of, we need to understand our US-Canada relationship as not just something that's a threat, but maybe an opportunity.
I just want to pick up on that last comment about legalize all drugs and live with the consequences. In fact, what we're finding already is the cannabis industry is complaining because the black market has not been eliminated. So just simply legalizing doesn't solve all our problems. It seemed, and because I haven't been in all of your discussion, I won't solve all the solutions, but it seems to me part of the answer has to be let me use the word complacency, that I consider us in Canada being too complacent in many things, especially in administration of laws. So why don't we, first of all, just have more border patrol to interdict, take the money away, take away the incentive for the crime in the first place? There's my first solution.
That is really the essence of the position that Charlie was taking, Alan, is it's the money laundering and the amount of money that is generated and how they get that money moved around and into their pockets. It's enormous. I don't know whether I mentioned earlier the movie Blow. If anybody has seen it, it'll blow your mind to see the amount of money we're talking about that has to be laundered. They have a problem. The drug cartels have a problem. They have too much money and they have to figure out how to get rid of it. And they use the casinos, they use real estate transactions. There are a variety of techniques, all of which should be policeable.
My point, Perry, or reaction to getting legalizing all drugs is that you're still going to have the laundering issues out there. Those guys will find another place to launder money. And it's not going to change fundamentally anything, except it might reduce the money that needs to be laundered, and for a period of time. But my history of watching this and trying to do something about it says that they're just going to move on to something else.
Well, you can't give up, though. I don't think that's your message.
No, it's not.
It's not going to be the issue we have at the moment appears to be one of, as Alan has put it, complacency. Are we doing enough relative to our neighbor to the south? We're not, and that's in a way what Trump has pointed to, and what Canada seems to be ready to acknowledge. But whether its leadership is prepared to reallocate the funds from what we're doing now to what we should be doing, that's a budgetary issue, and there's more clearly in a system than simply throwing money into the system. That's a waste. If you think systems, you've got to recognize with any reaction, you've got a number of ingredients and you need to deal with the entire package, which is both demand and we haven't spent any time at all. Consumption continues and the market grows. Is it our kids and our families or our schools? Why is it that we have this problem in the first place?
Well, I was going to say there's a couple of things. I think that legalizing all drugs is a real conundrum because doctors also, of course, prescribe drugs through the national formulary. These are drugs that are not over the counter, and they're not actually drugs that in most cases are promoted by the networks, that the crime networks, although morphine type things maybe in some respects, some of the heroin and some of the hard drugs of that sort. But nonetheless, it's an education issue. Our society doesn't understand. Like as kids, you learn you don't stick a knife into the socket in the wall.
Yeah.
Well, we got to get people to know that you don't take drugs without the penalty of death. I mean, it should be in those type of sharp contrasts. That's my comment I'd like to make.
Well,
but the issue of the national formulary fits in this too.
Well, when you say that, you say we need to do a rethink on some of these issues.
I think it's an education issue, and it's a societal issue. I mean, I think there's two issues, I guess. Many people, I think, particularly young, are taking drugs because they're depressed. They're lonely. Society is, definitely fragmenting at that level. The second point is we're wealthy in some respects, and so people use their spare time to experiment. But I don't think that those who are experimenting as adults, as opposed to the younger people, are doing it the hardest of drugs. They may fall into that, but I would think it's a smaller number. More are probably doing as we've now legalized cannabis. So that's probably the main one that's in circulation, and it's not, and I think it's actually probably had a big impact on the illegal side of selling cannabis, because the price of commercial now retail, cannabis is cheaper than they used to sell it, much cheaper.
Yeah.
So legalizing all drugs is, I don't think, the right thing, but it's a step in the right direction. We just don't know where the boundary is.
Well, it's a good point to wrap up, because we didn't spend very much time on prevention. Most of the time was on intervention, and particularly in the realm of money laundering, as a way to maybe get the supply disrupted. But we didn't spend much time on prevention. We did when we discussed homelessness, and at that time, much of it had to do with the attention which we need to give to our kids. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I will ask Charlie. I will thank Charlie